Hello world, it's Angela, and I want to go over a interesting UI component I developed recently. It builds on the dots on a map video that I did last, and this UI component is basically allowing you to draw a circle that selects the dots in this case, and you can drag and move it around. Um, it works with all the Mapbox.gl stuff. When you turn off the drawing mode, you can pan, you can zoom, you can even do the whole rotating thing. It can be rotated, zoomed in, um, click on it, make a new one. So this is interesting because it involves some slightly more advanced D3 techniques than just adding circles to the map. We're still drawing circles, but we're going to be using the drag behavior. We're going to be linking events so that when you move this around, we select the dots. And we're going to be drawing, several things based on projected coordinates. So let's take a look at the code. And again, I'm going to just take us through this. A lot of my videos in the past I've live coded, but I want to try out taking you through the code line by line. We can play with some of the variables if it makes sense, and then you can take this link and go play with it yourself, or try to incorporate the component into your own code if you'd like. So I also split out the component into this other file. It's using the towards reusable charts pattern. This is something that could be mapped into a React component. Like, you could just wholesale use this. It really just depends on an SVG being passed in and a few parameters. We'll go over what those all are and what it needs. And then here we'll go over how it's used as well. So we'll start with how it's used so you kind of get a sense for the motivation behind the way I implemented it. And we'll go over things you could also do with that. So here we're going to set up our map. This is just like the previous dots on a map. So if you want to see a simpler tutorial on how to get set up with Mapbox.gl, this component doesn't care about using Mapbox or anything else. It could be on top of Leaflet. But in this case, we're using Mapbox.gl just because it's fun. And so all this setup is the same. This is where we're actually going to set up the component itself. So we'll instantiate a new circle selector. We'll pass in the SVG container. It could also be a group or whatever, but in this case, the SVG container is fine. We'll pass in the projection function. So since we're using Mapbox, it will be, this is something we defined down here, the same one that we used in the previous video as well. We're just using the maps project function, and we have this convenience function to turn our data format into lat long points. This could be a D3 projection function, so if you're not using Mapbox but you want the same functionality on, let's say you have like a state, a US Atlas based map, and you have cities, you want to select cities or something like that, this could work just as well. We also need to give it an inverse projection, and a lot of, like with D3 projection functions, you could actually do projection.invert, but here we're unprojecting, making a point from an XY coordinate pair here. So this is useful because we need to be able to convert between, when we move this around, we're moving it around an XY space with the mouse, but then we want to turn it back into lat long coordinates. Like, all the data for this, like this center point, this control point, is all using lat long, which we'll see. And then we have the ability to activate and deactivate it, which is how we turn off the mouse movement. So now if I drag this, as map doing the zoom, this is convenient so that we can switch between modes of drawing this or zooming with the mouse, zooming and panning. And then we have a simple thing for this button. This button is just a div with some styling on it, and when you click on it, it will turn on or off the active state, turn the circle controller's active state to whatever the new state is, and then it will disable or enable the drag pan zooming of the Mapbox map, um, so that we can switch between those modes essentially. And then it updates its class just to turn the button on and off. We're also explicitly adding the zoom control. I think we did that last time. That's this, which in Mapbox.gl isn't on by default. And loading our data here, drawing our dots like we did in the last video. And this is a new part when the circle control is updated. So let's say we're editing it. It fires an update event anytime it's moved around, right? And you notice how these dots will turn blue again once they're out and purple when they're in. So that's being done with selecting all the dots. We're filling them based on a function. We get the distance between the center and whatever dot we're on. So all the dots will check their distance using a function. You pass in the lat long point, basically your data, uses the project function, calculates the distance, and then the circle distance, you can just get the distance between the center point and the control point for this radius, and we can compare those. So if the distance between the point and the center is less than the radius, then it'll be inside the circle, and then we can fill it a different color. So this is kind of nice because you can determine your own logic for, let's say you had other kinds of data elements being drawn here, or maybe more complicated ones. You would be able to ask the component for the radius and its center, or the distance between whatever latitude, longitude, and the center of the circle, and it handles those calculations for you. Also, there's a clear event, so when you click on the circle and you don't drag anything, it clears everything. You want everything to go back to its original color, which makes sense. And then finally, whenever we re-render, so if we're drawing our circle, when the map re-renders, we have to reproject all our dots, but we also want to reproject our selecting circle, right? So everything needs to be drawn again. And so we have an update function in our component which handles the rendering, and that all gets called in the render. So let's take a look at the selector. Here we are instantiating our selector, this is the constructor basically, passing the SVG element. We're going to use it when you first set everything up, because there's going to be these mouse events that we're going to listen for. We have a number of states that we keep track of inside our component. So we have the variables where we're going to hold the center point and the outer point, which will be lat long points. There's the whether or not we've completed the circle. So that looks like, so at first that's going to be false. We're going to click once and it's still not going to be selected, but we click the second time to put down the control point. Now we've selected that, and that'll be true. Whether or not we're dragging will also be another thing we keep track of internally, and that's useful because we don't want, when we're dragging, we don't want to trigger behaviors like clearing it, which happen on the click under certain conditions. Whether or not we're active, if we're not active, we don't want to have any of the mouse listeners or the dragging fire. We save our container for use later. And we do have, this is what I was talking about with the projections, the default, we could have Mercator, but really the user should almost always specify what projection and unprojection they want. And these will be set, all of these using the pattern of, let me scroll down here to the end. Really all the getter setters are done in the reusable chart pattern. So let's go through and see what, like how we link up these behaviors and how that's all done. And we'll just start top down. So we're going to have a dispatch. So d3.dispatch allows you to make basically a very simple event engine. So we will have an update and a clear event. And at certain points, we'll fire events when we do stuff in here that the outside world can listen on. So that's also hooked up with this rebind function, you can use the dispatch. So this will mean that the circle selector itself will have an on method where we can listen for the update and clear events. And if you remember over here, we have circle selector on update. So whenever it updates, we recalculate who's inside, and whenever it clears, we clear everything, right? So that's handy. A lot of the construction of the circle is handled in these two, the mouse up, the mouse up and the mouse move. I chose mouse up instead of click because it's just slightly easier to deal with, but yeah, it's effectively the same thing. When you basically click, when you let up, the difference would be that you can click down and then let up and it won't clear that. So it's kind of nice because you can decide in the middle of your action that you don't want to do it anymore. So let's take a look. This is something that's central to all the interactions. We get the XY coordinates of where the mouse clicks. Let's console.log these two things, P and the LL. And so whenever we click, you'll see 171, 283. So that was 171 from here, 283 from here. And then it converts it to the latitude, longitude coordinate. And I clicked again here. The X is slightly longer, the Y is slightly less, 249, 196. So d3.mouse always gives you the XY coordinate relative to the container. So since this is the SVG, since we're in the SVG's mouse listener, we're going to get it from the top left of the SVG. If you are doing this in some smaller group that is embedded in the SVG and you only wanted to be able to do the selection there, it would be XY coordinates within that group. So as long as you're using those coordinates inside the thing that you're getting the mouse, you should always draw, it will draw where you click, basically. Let me close the console again and get rid of that for now. So then we have some logic here where it's based on whether or not, and this red line is a small bug we'll have to fix where it's not clearing the error. Like we had an error for a brief moment and then now we don't actually. Let's go back here. Boom, gone. All right, so this logic basically says that if there is a circle selector, because remember, circle center, remember the first time you click, there's nothing. So when we click, there is no circle center, so that logic won't happen. It'll be here. The initial click sets the circle center and the circle outer, which is the control point, to wherever you first click. So when I click, both points exist there. And then you see stuff is happening as I move my mouse, which will be this mouse move down here, which all it's really doing is the same calculation here, and then setting the outer point to the move. So every time we move the mouse, the control point is just following the mouse around. So you can see that, right? We're constantly updating that, and we're calling the update function, which is defined below here, which does all the rendering. So we'll get into that shortly. Then when I place my second click, the center was already defined, so we have that. So if the circle is, oh yeah, and then we check if it's selected. If it's selected, we don't want to do anything. We could probably change this to a not selected. I used to have a different behavior here. Let's just go ahead and do that. We'll make this, if the circle is not selected, we want to set the outer lat long, like the outer to permanently be that lat long, and then selected will be true. So now when we move the mouse around, this will return before updating it, right? So that just kind of cements it in place. Yeah, so that's basically it for drawing this, the two control points and the outer circle, or not drawing, but setting the two pieces of data we need to draw everything. So everything is just based on those 2 points. Then we'll get into the dragging. So dragging, we can either drag from the center or we can drag the control point to resize after the fact. So if it's active, if we're not active, we don't do any dragging. And then there's two cases here. If the circle is selected, then we can do drag behaviors. But if it's not selected, we don't want to do anything, because if you're still drawing here, you don't want to drag to get in the way of this. You just want it to behave as usual. But once it's drawn, you can drag. So how's this working? Again, we see this, getting the XY coordinate. This time we're passing it the node of the SVG, since this on drag behavior is not for the whole SVG, it's for dragging. When you drag one of these circles, the drag behaviors you'll see shortly is attached to the control points themselves. So we need to get the XY coordinate relative to the SVG. But otherwise, the unproject thing, we get the lat long from the XY coordinate there, works the same. And this little thing is just saying so there's two circles we can drag on. Like we'll see when we draw them. Where's the drag behavior? So I think this is the control points here. So when we're clicking this, here's where we call it the drag. So when we draw these control points with the circle center and circle outer. So I0 is circle center, I equals 1 is a circle outer. So let's go up here to see the drag behavior. So if that means we're dragging on this element here, and we have lat long, and we're assigning it to the outer. So basically, as we drag this around, we're reassigning the circle outer, and we update here. Then as we do the latitude, longitude, if it's not I, that means I is 0, then we need to do a little bit more. We set the center of the circle, we make it follow the mouse around, which is great, but we also want to move the control point along with it. So that would make the whole circle move. If we don't do that, we'll have some slightly strange and interesting behavior where as we move this around, the control point stays still. And while it's kind of cool, it's not really what people would expect, I think. So we just essentially find out what the difference between the original circle center and the new point is, and then we move the outer point by that same amount. So if I move this to the left however much, 100 pixels is going to move this one to the left 100 pixels. So then finally, when we end the drag, it sets dragging to false. There's a little set timeout, which is kind of hacky, but that's so that the mouse up handler doesn't fire when you do, let go here and destroy the circle, because right now we have a mouse up that destroys the circle, and I'll show you that in a second. Actually, it's an on click. So let's go over the rendering. This is really the last part. It's a bit involved, but it's all pretty standard D3 stuff. So let's just go through it line by line. And it's kind of cool because it's all based on just these 2 points. So how do we do that? First of all, we get a distance between the center point and the outer point, right? And that's going to give us our radius to draw this big circle. So I'm calling it circle lasso. And essentially we're just selecting all the circles named lasso with this one data point. That means there's only going to be one circle. When we enter, we append that circle with its class. So whenever we update, like this function gets called all the time when we zoom or do other stuff, it's only ever going to have that one circle with its click behavior, which we'll go over in a second. But we're always going to update this here. Is not part of the enter. The circle lasso is just the selection, and we're setting its CX and CY, and we're setting the R to be the distance. So the distance is also in pixels, by the way. It's in the projected space. So that's what this function will do. And I'll show you the distance function. We can look at it right now. It's at the bottom. We basically project 2 lat long, so our center and our outer get passed in there, and then we just do a Euclidean distance, the square root of ax minus bx squared, ay minus by squared, and return that number. So yeah, we have our radius gets recalculated from that, and our center gets moved around as projected. We style it all in here. To make this a real component, probably want to allow the user to style that stuff via CSS instead, maybe. And what else do we got? So this part is also sort of the last bit of state stuff, because when you click on the lasso itself, it will, if it's not active, if it's active, if it's not active, you can click all you want, nothing happens. But if it's active and you click on it, it destroys it. So we basically just set everything to null and false. We remove manually all the things that we draw, and we fire the clear event, which is what allows us to recolor those points. All right, so a couple other UI pieces. When you're dragging around, you see this dotted line. So we do the same thing. We basically draw a line. The data itself doesn't matter. It just needs to be one of them. And we have a condition that we only want to draw the line when either you're dragging, or in the beginning there's a line while you're haven't selected yet, but once you've selected, we don't want to draw a line anymore. And the line is very simple to draw. You just give it two xy points, the starting point and the end point, and we just do it from the center to the outer. We just project everything and get the x and y coordinates, and we style it with a stroke dash array, and that's what makes it a dotted line. So it's 5 pixels of stroke and 5 pixels of emptiness, and that's where the 5, 5 comes from. If we made this 15, we would have much longer lines, and we could do the same for this. You can see that there's bigger gaps, but we'll just keep it 5 and 5. And we also remove the line if this condition is not true. So it's pretty simple. All right, and we already looked at the control circles here, and we just append both of them, update their positions the exact same way we do the dots and everything else. We style them directly in these attributes. Again, something that we would probably want to expose to the user somehow, but you're welcome to copy paste this for now, and this has mostly been a prototype anyway. And here we also have the cursor differences. So if it's active, we change the cursor to this little move icon when you can drag it. If it's not active, that shouldn't. Oh, that's like a minor thing. This doesn't get updated when you click this. We should probably call the update function when you change this, but now there's no move cursor there. Just a little minor bug. Leave as an exercise for the viewer. All right, and we called the drag. We saw that before. Also, when we click the control points, we stop the event propagation. I think this is to avoid clicking in this control point, also destroying that. Let's actually confirm that hunch. So I'll delete that temporarily, and we'll do this, and then if I click this, oh no, I guess it's just not necessary. It might have been while I was developing this, I had to I went through a couple of different ways of handling the click events on the SVG, and once I moved everything into the component, things got a little more straightforward. So sometimes that happens. A little bit of dead code, just clean it up. And then finally, we call the dispatch update. So this is what fires the update event. So every time we this rendering happens, we can call this update, and that's what, remember, helps us color these circles here. This stuff is all really standard fare. Basically, if you're not familiar with it, the pattern is, so if we want to set the projection, you pass in a projection. So if there's not a value, it's a getter function. So it gives back the projection function that you already have. If there is a value, it sets, the project variable that's used internally to that value, and we return this so that we can chain. And so you see that over here where um, we call the projection, we pass in the function we want to set, and then we call another function, pass in the value. So these are all chained, and that allows us to, and returning this inside allows us to do that. So that's pretty much all the code. Let's go full screen, see how big of a circle we can make. Hope you enjoyed this. This, like I said, is a slightly different style than I've been doing. I think this went a lot faster than if I had coded it all in front of you. There are trade-offs though. So let me know what you think in the comments about this style of video. I'm thinking of actually going through more of my blocks in this fashion to kind of let you know what I was thinking, or give some context to those blocks. Yeah, so don't forget to subscribe. Let me know what you think, and see you in the next video.